You are listening to a podcast from The Hindu.
Actually, JBS would not. I mean, if we were to meet him, if he heard this podcast, I don't think his self would really appreciate us because I don't think he liked journalists much.
But he married one.
I think Elon Musk could have made friends with him rather than Donald Trump.
Yeah.
He was like the science bro. He would have been a very popular science podcaster if he was alive
Imagine
today,
if
right?
he had Haldane as a guest.
He would have
Oh
been the
my
Joe
God.
Rogan, I guess. I mean, not in the science thing, but at least in popularity. I am Jacob Koshy.
And I'm Sobhana Nair, and this is the
Rearview. Here we dive into the history of things, events, discoveries, and inventions.
So, Jacob, what are we discussing today?
Well, we're going to be talking about a scientist who was born in 1892 in Britain on Guy Fawkes Day, and that was a precursor to his lifelong rebellion.
But he died as an Indian.
He was a scholar of the Greek classics,
He was a scientist who never had a formal science degree.
and he was the founding father of that field in evolutionary biology called population genetics.
He was a communist who embraced Marxism in his 30s,
And he died a socialist towards the end.
who rebelled against his own country.
Rebelled against everything.
Everything.
Anything and everything.
Yes.
This is
John Burdon Sanderson Haldane.
and popularly called as Jack.
JBS Haldane, the eternal rebel.
Like broken glass under my feet, I can lose my mind in the sea.
So we have this very, very interesting, very eclectic, very colorful scientist. And as we probably just intimated you, he actually spent the latter half of his life in India. And he was one of the scientists who was brought in into newly independent India to kind of, seed the whole field of evolutionary biology and population genetics. And so, Shobna, there's a lot to actually uncover about JBS Haldane. We are going to primarily rely on this, on this wonderful book by Saman Subramaniam, the dominant character. And it is I mean, there have been a lot of write-ups on JBS Haldane because he was a very well-known person throughout history. But Samant has done this wonderful job of getting deep and discussing his politics and his science, and there is so much to unpack over here. So what did you actually find? Where does he come from?
Let me first describe the man. Imagine, a journalist described him as a large, woolly rhinoceros of uncertain temper. He was a huge man. He was 6 feet plus, a king-sized man in rumpled clothes, his mustache so thick, and his head so large. Very Hagrid kind of a person, without beard, with a booming voice, and unlike Hagrid, an extremely intelligent and intellectually curious.
You wouldn't be talking about me now, would you?
No. So Jacob, Haldanes were one of the few British families that could track their ancestry back through the male line to the 12th century. And the name, it is said, derives from half Dane, suggesting that the first of the Haldanes arrived from Scandinavia, probably as settlers or more likely as raiders.
He came in like had a full Viking kind of lineage, I can
Uh,
see.
That's why he
That's
looks
him.
like a Viking. You all you need is one of those helmets, and he could very well fit into the dragon.
Hagar the Horrible.
How to Train Your Dragon movies. Anyhow, the fact that he was a rebel most of his life actually does not come as a surprise because his parents were confirmed rebels.
His father was a scientist too.
His father was a professor of physiology in Oxford. His they came from a very wealthy family, but unlike their sort of very affluent circumstances, they were very much in touch with the plebeians, as one may say. And
So they had a social
they
conscience and
had a
not just aristocratic, for I
yes,
would say.
and they were agnostics, which itself is a huge thing for the era that they belong to. And they've always been into minor rebellions. For example, when his parents got married, his mother, uh, breaking the tradition of coming from the main entrance of the church, actually entered from the side gate,
Oh,
just as a
was it
side
from
of
the left side of the gate?
rebelling. Probably. I don't know. Samant book does not mention it. I'm sure if he writes
Did his
another.
father also share the same? Did father and son have the same expanded name?
Yes, his father was John Scott Haldane, so
So it's the
called
burden.
J.S. Haldane, and Burdon, the name comes from his mother's side. Now, before he was 5, JBS Haldane, also lovingly called Jack, was reading aloud newspaper reports of the meetings of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. He remembered everything he heard, everything he saw in a book. His memory was capacious and
Must
precise.
have been a terrible toddler. Imagine, if your child can recite anything and everything as a 2-year old you say in front of them. I'm sure you've gone through those moments, as I have.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is something we face on a daily basis as parents. Legend has it that when he was not yet 4, he looked intently at the blood trickling out of a cut at his forehead and asked, "Is it oxyhemoglobin or carbooxyhemoglobin?" Like his father, he and his sister Naomi went on long, sweaty rambles, and Jack transcribed everything he saw into his diaries.
Natural diarist and
Yeah,
like observer of things around him and
very
chronicler of.
Charles Dickens, I would say.
Yeah. Oh, okay. But less in a social context manner, but more about, I guess, nature and all the
Yes, yes.
odd plants and animals and life and those kinds of things.
Yeah, but I would still think that he's very Charles Dickens in a scientific way. Now, his father, as I told you, was a professor of physiology at Oxford, and he spent his life researching respiration. John Scott Haldane studied the impact of shift in the chemical composition of gas and their impact on human body from the depths of the mines to the depths of oceans. And JBS was a partner, often his guinea pig.
So this was this period when to be a scientist meant that it was par for course for you yourself to experiment upon yourself. I mean, if you had a theory regarding a particular effect that a particular gas might have on the body, it was par for course for you to actually inject the gas yourself, put yourself into all of that.
I was quite blown away by the fact that it was Father Haldane who is behind the cannery in the mine concept. Because he, as I said, that he's spent all his life researching respiration, he was called in to investigate death of miners in the depths of coal mines. And what surprised everyone was that the miner's lamp was still burning, which meant that there was it was not for lack of oxygen that they had died, but there was something else afoot and which needed to be investigated. It was JS who went down and his
Experienced all the
experiments.
dizziness and
Yeah,
for
he.
himself, experienced all that complete loss of consciousness. And did he get unconscious fully?
I don't think he fell
Completely passed out. Yeah.
unconscious, but anyhow, he was the one who came to the conclusion that it was the rise in the level of carbon monoxide which was responsible for their death, and it was he who suggested that the miners should carry either a small rat or a small bird like a canary, and because increase in monoxide levels would impact them because of their smaller mass at a far greater speed than human beings, and if the canary dies, then it gives the miners enough time to come
Wonder if
out
that
of.
is the origin of the phrase the canary in the coal mine, right? Wherein you send something out as a test to see.
I think so. That just blew my mind. But as I said, Jacob, Father Haldane actually used to use his son for a lot of these
And
experiments
in
also.
this day and age, I mean, it was always a morally and ethically fraught question. So this was, in fact, one of the most famous experiments was actually sending Jack, who was, I think, barely who was just 13 years old. He was actually sent down, in a diving suit from a ship called the HMS Spanker. And this was actually to investigate, what divers experience, called the bends. That is, it is when there is a nitrogen buildup inside your body at particular depths. I think I should just read out how, how someone describes it. On the day of his dive, Jack was first seated in the recompression chamber and taught to swallow hard to clear the pressure that would build up in his ear tubes. Even so, when he started the rapid descent down to 40 feet, his ears felt fit to burst. Then he realized he had a bigger problem. The lock was streaming into his suit through the gap between his wrists and his baggy cuffs and beginning to pool round his ankles. Even in late summer, the water was frigid. When Jack was called up, the water in his suit had risen past his waist. He could feel it lapping around him as he moved, but he still had to go through the staged decompression, and as he waited out the minutes at each level, his suit filled even further, up to his chest, near his shoulders. Only the air being forced into his helmet was keeping the water from climbing any higher. By the time he was back on deck, the suit had flooded up to his neck, and he was shivering from the cold, and no doubt from terror. J.S., his father, dosed Jack with whiskey and put him to bed in Daman's bunk, where he slept for a very long time.
Exemplary parenting, one must say.
Absolute parenting. So that's,
Imagine if we were to do something of this sort
yeah, would be
in
very
today's
much
day and
behind
age.
multiple bars without bail and no UAP also required.
Nothing. Now, for a popular scientist, Jacob, he did not possess a degree in science. In 1911, he enrolled in Oxford to study classics and mathematics. Basically, he felt that he was learning sciences on his own out of his sheer interest, and he didn't know enough about history and philosophy, so he decided, let me learn that.
Yeah, and the scientific education was natural to him, right? I mean, as we've just been
He was
discussing about.
born into it.
But this is something so outlandish today because considering what he later contributed to an entire field of science. I mean, right now science is such a specialized field, and but actually JBS was among, he was among that generation where it was actually still possible to get what is called a classical education, classical by, English public school standards. And you were exposed to literature, you were exposed to what we would today call the humanities, and it was not really unusual for somebody to actually pursue a very hard science career. But that's also because JBS actually treated biology, which was to become his defining forte, in the language of math.
Yes.
And it was the math. So he was never known as a great experimenter like the laboratory guy, though there is evidence that he did a lot of interesting experiments, but he was primarily a, the thinker, the theorist kind of person.
And Haldane's facility with numbers provided the scaffolding for all his work.
Yeah.
And he used to say, if you are faced with a difficulty or controversy in science, an ounce of algebra is worth a ton of verbal argument.
That is such a slap to us journalists, right? We use reams and reams of words and not a single equation.
No, and as soon as I see multiple zeros, my head starts swimming.
Actually,
So-
JBS would not. I mean, if we were to meet him, if he heard this podcast, I don't think his self would really appreciate us because I don't think he liked journalists much.
But he married one.
Yeah, and
And we'll come to that story.
Yeah.
Let's not jump the gun, because in between JB's life, there is a big punctuation mark called the First World War.
Yes. And how did he get into it?
He, even before he finished his degree, the World War broke, and it is First World War in many ways is the ground zero of the contemporary human history. All our problems that we are facing today can be traced back to the First World War and
Some way to the other.
accentuated further by the Second World War. And I'm not very clear on how he landed in the war, but I guess at that point there was not much choice other than the
So
clergymen.
what
And
did he actually do? Did he actually like
he was
in
sent
the
to the
trenches?
trenches, and he was the bomb officer.
Hmm.
In fact, before I get into what he did, his father played an important role in First World War. In the First World War, that we see for the first time usage of chlorine gas, a weaponization of chlorine gas.
Of industrial gases in general,
Yeah.
as Fritz Haber had discovered that.
So when chlorine gas was released, at I believe at the French
In French in
frontier,
Germany, France
um,
and Germany,
JS was called in to investigate, and
with his experience with gases and
gases, and that was the only time the father and son were together at the front. And in fact, again, JBS was his guinea pig. He experimented the impact of chlorine gas on, of course it was a controlled experiment on his own son, to see what can be
so
the
again it was Jack
possible
who was inhaling
the chlorine
varying
gas.
degrees of chlorine gas.
Yes.
Do you think all these gaseous experiments kind of contributed to his mind, to him becoming who he was,
Muddling his head
Yeah,
with
and-
multiple ideas.
and an absolute
Thankfully,
lack of fear for
yeah, thankfully it
consequences?
just went, it all fell right, it didn't go the other direction. But at that point they could not have created too many gas masks. Ideally, that is what
Hmm.
should have happened, but I think that till that point they weren't able to manufacture in those numbers, in those greater numbers.
So once they determined that it was actually chlorine gas, before that, the soldiers who were first exposed to it, they just followed their officers' orders, whose initial antidote was piss on your handkerchiefs and tie them over your faces. And because this was the thing that the ammonia in urine could absorb chlorine, and stop them from dying. But so JS actually noted this, and he wanted to make it a little more scientific, and so he
And more
yeah.
usable, I
And imagine,
presume.
guess pissing would be the last thing on your mind when you're facing an onslaught of
No, I'm sure they
a
must be
colorless.
missing enough,
Yeah,
but
but you would not know this. It is a odorless, colorless gas, right? It is
I
something
think
that just overwhelms
yeah,
you.
I think we're
But
discussing
anyway,
too much of.
we've taken enough of the piss out of it. So again, JS decided to develop some kind of a respirator, and as usual, he first tested it upon himself. He was a good father. He first tested it upon himself and then his son.
Small
So
mercies.
small mercies. So within a week, he had a kind of device. So it was a gauze pad dampened with sodium thiosulfate and glycerine that could be tied over a soldier's nose and mouth. And this was the stopgap arrangement before an actual respirator was invented. As usual, Jack was united with his dad, and he too was made the guinea pig. So they actually devised a chamber, and father and son, they took their turns, and with a respirator bound on their faces, and they would see at what degree you know their breathing would change. And they actually, even outdoors, they actually ran for 50 yards, because you had to actually simulate, because so how far a soldier could run, with this device on them. That's eventually how they came up with a kind of respirator with self experimentation.
After the thrill of the First World War, Haldane, in fact, had one of the most fertile period of was the one of the most fertile period of his scientific life. Haldane, in fact, is known for the 10 papers, the scientific papers that he wrote between 1924 to 1934.
In fact, it was after the war. It's a bit of a mystery to, I guess, everyone around Haldane himself. How is it that he, a class 6 guy, went to the war and came back as a person, who would, as a biologist, as somebody who would be studying biology. Because in someone's book, he actually talks about how this was this time when you know na- there were many fundamental discoveries about about nature and the world being made. I mean, you had relativity, you had the discovery of some of subatomic particles, and you also had genetics. I mean, Mendelian genetics, as well as Darwin's the theory of natural selection. And there was this aura. I mean, there were already some prominent scientists who were studying Mendelian genetics, and they were experimenting with fruit flies, and this whole idea of genes and their presence on chromosomes and how they determine the variations in life. It was a sexy kind of field to pursue, and I guess Haldane thought that he wanted to be at the center of it, and he said, "Okay, after poison gases and respirators, this looks like the next cool thing to do."
Do you know what was the next cool thing that he did?
What was it?
Okay, so in 1919, Haldane joined New College in Oxford. And the cool thing that he was doing was trying to drink hydrochloric acid to test the acidity in blood.
It's a miracle he's alive.
Yes. And the fact that he went on to live for that long, I mean, not that
Yeah.
very long,
Now we
but
can probably explain the causes that he died, but we'll come to it later.
and that is because the father and the son were united in the pursuit of finding out exactly what are the impact of hydrochloric acid on blood. And this is probably the beginning of his career as a biologist. So in 1922, Haldane actually published his first major paper in evolutionary biology, and it laid down what came to be known as Haldane's rule. What exactly is Haldane's rule?
So this is like, as we were discussing, this was the time when there were two major, there were two major explanations that had come up for how living beings pass on, how living beings have so much variety, how species is originated. So there is, of course, Charles Darwin's natural selection. You know, the basic idea is that there are small changes that are accumulated over time, and over time, when those changes are favorable for a species and helps it adapt to its environment, over time small changes build up, and sometimes a species can undergo an evolution. But once the famous Gregor Mendel's experiments on, I mean, he had done these experiments a long time back, and he had found out that when you're crossing certain kinds of plants together, there were certain traits were passed on, and it was the passing on of these traits that determined characteristics like height or color. This so then there was one set of people, that or one set of scientists, who saw that it was not really it may not be just incremental variations that are building up, but it could be these inherited characters. Later on we would call them genes, but it is this inherited mutations, changes in these genes, that actually was responsible for much of the variety. And sometimes you could actually lead to big changes. Big species could suddenly come up if the right genes or right heritable traits pass through. So, but it was a bit of a clash. I mean, is evolution going in slow, in slow places, in at a slow incremental pace like natural selection, or is it in jumps from the inheritance of heritable characteristics? So
And it was Haldane who actually constructed the bridge between the
the synthesis.
Mendelian theory and The Darwinian
the
theory.
Darwinian theory. So it is called, I mean, in fact, today I mean, in the 50s, it was called the modern synthesis, wherein, you gave a role for everything. I mean, you gave a role that natural selection was the dominant force by which evolution happened in nature. But there were also powerful instances of Mendelian genes, and then there were other genetic drift. So, but he was a bit, and he united this with math. He constructed these very very deep kind of equations. He hypothesized all kinds of situations, where different kinds of species are interbred, and he relied on the data that was done by different kinds of scientists, on testing which of these factors were at work. So he made this, he united this. And one of these things called the Haldane's rule, I mean, that basically explained, for instance, how one species, when it reached at some evolutionary point, it could diverge into among two different paths. And those species, like for example, in human beings, it is the females who have got who are XX, or they've got homogame, whose sex chromosomes have the same XX configuration, whereas the males have an XY configuration. In the birds, it's actually opposite. When you cross different kinds of species together, there have always been questions as to how, for instance, when two new species combine, their first offspring could actually be sterile. It was, so for example, when a horse and a donkey were mated, the mule is actually a sterile animal. This is a problem that has been talked about since the times of Aristotle. But over time, you could actually then see a completely new species evolve. And Haldane gave a very mathematical explanation for this, explaining how exactly first sterility can be followed subsequently by the evolution of entire different species. And the great bit is that this rule is generally kind of true even how. So this was the kind of the birth of this field called population genetics. There was also the American scientist Sewall Wright and Ronald Fisher. I mean, he along with they both of them, along with Haldane, are considered the founders of what is called population genetics. How mutations proceed through generations. How many mutations would it actually take, for a completely for one species, one variant of a species to become the more dominant one. So all of this theoretical ideas were kind of established by Haldane.
But when we're talking about population genetics, there is another word which is treated with extreme contempt in today's time:
Hmm.
eugenics.
Oh yes, of course.
Haldane was also one of the uh, pioneers of eugenics, and he had a very, very positive, almost one can say almost naive view of eugenics.
Well, I wouldn't actually call, because Shobna, we have to actually see it in the context of the time, because this was this in it was. So let if we can just back up a little. So Haldane was also like a writer. He composed a lot of works of science fiction and literature. So I think one of his famous books was Daedalus. I mean, it was based on the Greek character Daedalus, the guy the master sculptor and inventor,
Yeah,
who
the
actually,
architect of the labyrinth at Minos.
and the father of Icarus. I mean, he designed the wings for his son Icarus and told him not to fly too high lest he be burned. And the obedient child that Icarus was, he flew too close to the sun, burned and died. And he kind of, so Daedalus always is this image of this inventor whose inventions somehow would always bring tragedy. But in the context of genetics, I mean, you have learned of this new principle by which species are made. You're learning that there are certain genes, or this thing called genes. They influence, they influence physical physical aspects. So even from a very socialist bent of mind, they had this belief, I mean several of them, that you could actually improve society. I mean, technology was seen as this thing. I mean, especially this is the industrial age. Technology was seen as something that could be used to improve people's lives. Science in general could be used to improve people's lives. So if you're learning scientific principles like of genetics, could they be used to improve improve societies,
And
populations?
Haldane was actually a firm believer in what you're saying. So, coming back to Daedalus, it was February 1923. Haldane was asked to give a talk to the Heretics, a Cambridge society. His address became so popular that he was invited to turn it into a small book. Daedalus, published in 1924, it sold more than 15,000 copies in its first year.
And it was the inspiration for Aldous Huxley's more famous Brave New World.
Yes,
They were
and
friends or contempt. I think Aldous Huxley's brother Julian Huxley and Haldane were classmates.
I think so. And Haldane actually, that book sort of made Haldane into a man who did his thinking in public. Uh, Daedalus is known for many things, including its smart predictions. He had predicted in this lecture, which later turned into a book, that humankind will switch to wind and solar energy. There will be hydrogen fuel cells, and wait for it, semi ectogenesis, test tube babies, which is ectogenesis basically bringing up a fetus, growing a fetus outside a mother's body, basically making a baby in a petri dish. But it is foremost a manifesto for society on how to deal with its scientists, how to allow them to light the way to human happiness.
So it
Just
was like a original, he was like the science bro. It's like how we have the tech bros now who are always dreaming of how different technologies or AI run wild is actually better for the species as a whole. So this was very science bro, bio bro.
absolutely
That
bio bro. But
that
it was viral. This book of his was viral. Einstein owned a copy of Daedalus, and in pencil he had marked Haldane's emphasis of ethics, and as you just pointed out, fiction writers borrowed ideas from it to paint this really dystopian societies of future.
but in that sense utopian, right? I mean, he projected as
He
utopian.
projected
Yeah.
it completely as a utopian idea. And as I was saying, why I thought Haldane's view of eugenics is naive is because of this paragraph Haldane wrote, and I'm quoting: less than a million years hence, the average man or woman will realize all the possibilities that human life has so far shown. He or she will never know a minute's illness. He will be able to think like Newton, to write like Racine, to paint like Van Eyck's, to compose like Bach. He will be as incapable of hatred as Saint Francis, and when death comes at the end of a life, probably measured in thousands of years, he will meet it with as little fear. Every minute of his life will be lived with all the passion of a lover or a discoverer. We can form no idea whatever of the exceptional men of such a future.
This is so similar to, for example, people like Brian Johnson, the guys who are experimenting on themselves to live forever and be forever young.
But within his lifetime, he was proven wrong that eugenics was not. In fact, he thought that eugenics will remove hatred, but eugenics became a bad word because it propagated hatred with racial selection and
There was nothing EU about, it was just EWU instead of EU,
abs.
the
and
Greek part.
and he did a later part of his life whenever he was called for lectures across the globe, he spoke out against this racial selection that was aimed at removing certain feeble-minded members of the human race. So, as I just said, that by with this book, Haldane had become this super popular figure.
People were like writing to him, and he was like the general guy you just wrote to, and if you wanted any of your scientific questions answered, right? He was like,
Or if you were working on something and you wanted it checked, he was a sounding board also for many.
he would have been a very popular science podcaster if he was alive
Imagine
today,
if
right?
we had Haldane as a guest.
He would have
Oh
been the
my
Joe
god.
Rogan, I guess. I mean, not in the science thing, but at least in popularity.
Yeah, but you know that Haldane had a very acerbic sense of humor also, right?
Yeah.
He would rip anyone apart at any point of time, no matter how close you are to him, because there are Saman's book mentions incidents where people who are super close to him sending him their paper for a review, and him actually replying not at all politely, saying very brusquely, "My dear, I believe you should just stop this field of science because you are incapable of it."
How
So he
how
was,
polite.
yeah, very, very polite. But, anyways, floored by Haldane's very unique thought process and his incandescent persona, journalist Charlotte Franken,
Journalist.
yes, came to interview him. She was, interestingly, also the first woman to report from the press gallery at the House of Lords.
Wow.
She was of a socialist bent of mind
She was also a trailblazer in her own right.
in her own life. And at the time of their meeting, Charlotte was married and had a son. But of course, it was like two bright minds coming together. They grew close soon, and
I don't think Jack actually liked her very much, precisely because he was a journalist, and she was a journalist.
in fact, in their very first meeting, Jack warned her and said that if the last person who interviewed me messed up my interview, but if you do my interview well, then I will take you out for lunch. And he was impressed with what he saw in the magazine, and of course they met for lunch, and then rest was history.
Love is in the air, everywhere I look around.
What does this say about science and journalism ethics, Shobana?
Why are we getting into it? There are far more unethical things that are going to happen ahead of you. So at that point of time, divorce was,
So they fell in love and they
they wanted to
decided
get
to get
married.
married. Yeah.
They wanted to get married, but she was already married. She needed to get a divorce from her first husband. But at that time, the law recognized only adultery as grounds for divorce. And judges demanded detailed proof of the transgression. So, Jacob, you will love this. The two actually staged adultery.
Adultery.
They had a sort of a detective follow them around while they booked themselves in a fancy hotel. And the fun bit is that they had picked up a hotel. They reached the hotel, and Charlotte didn't like the hotel, and she didn't. But they wanted to be seen by this detective. So JBS actually went up to the person who he thought was the detective and told him, "Listen, we are shifting to a different hotel, so please follow us to there." So it was
And they were also, and I believe the detective also arranged for some reporters to hang out over there, and so that they could prove that yes, indeed,
catch them.
Jack was in a room with some with some woman, and then her husband also shows up over there, and therefore it was officially an act of adultery.
Yeah, imagine the
The
lengths one
things,
has
yeah,
to go back
to
then. Anyhow,
go around the law.
but yeah, but
So they got married
they did get
eventually.
married. They did get married, and they had initially a very lovely relationship, but of course it soared later on in the life, but for various reasons, and we can get into it later.
Eventually, he married somebody much younger to.
Much younger, 22 years younger to him. But we are again jumping the gun here, so let us go slow. Charlotte's important contribution to Haldane's life was politics, ideology, in a way. I mean, she did contribute to it. But as we've already seen, that Haldane was of a very socialist mindset right from the beginning. He loved trenches because it was a democratic space. He, unlike his background, he was so different from his other peers in
And he
his
believed in the uses
outlook.
of science for social upliftment, and science as something he believed that people. That's why, I mean, it also animated his, there's the science writing and his science popularization, because he did not just tell people, oh, this is what the science says. He wanted to encourage this whole scientific method thing later on, as even Nehru would probably popularize in his own way as scientific temper, that people should be taught to think about nature, about, from in non-theological ways, and learn about science to make decisions for yourself that would improve your life. I mean, that was his general attitude towards science, I guess. So that explains the socialist bent, in him.
Yeah, it was his. He was in his mid 30s when he fell in love with Karl Marx.
Ah,
Karl Marx read The Origin of Species, Darwin's Origin of Species, more than once, and heard in The Struggle of Species to Adapt and Survive an echo of the class struggle. In Darwin's Natural History, he told Engels, progress is merely accidental, whereas the course of human history was result of coherent material causes. And like Darwin, Haldane spotted a correspondence between political and scientific thought. He saw genetics, and rightly so, was intrinsically political. And trawling through Marx and Engels, Haldane found some particular personal resonance as well. Marxism was utterly irreligious. It privileged practice over theory, something that Haldane as a boy had seen his father do in his own field. But it wasn't exactly love at first sight.
adopt in Mark for Mark in Marxism.
Yeah, it took him time to warm up to Marxism. And
But one interesting, I mean, as you mentioned, this correspondence that he saw was, this the parallels between what is called the Hegelian dialectic. As so Marx derived, it was basically a material form of the German philosopher from 100 years before Marx, I guess. Hegel, I mean, who gave this whole idea that history also follows laws. I mean, you have you have a set of circumstances happening, and within them, there is within any trend, it also carries the seeds of its own destruction. So you have two opposite trends happening, and then those opposite trends, because they eventually clash, they come up to a midpoint, which is the synthesis. So there is the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. And I uh, Jack kind in these, he saw the same thing happening in biology, I guess.
exactly, the
Here
parallels
is
were
there is a
there.
natural selection which is on one side, and there is mutations happening on the other side, two different theories. And just as he was a kind of synthesizer of this, he saw, hey, this is something that seems to be working in the biology. So I guess that must have given him this notion that this is very much in the mold of the Hegelian dialectic, etc.
Absolutely. So in 1928, MI5 opened a file on him. For them, he was a communist even before he actually became one. Because it is only 1942 that he actually formally joins the British Communist Party.
Oh, really? Okay. So till then, he was just flirting with communism.
Jacob, this was also the time when he started flirting with Soviet Union. So after marrying Charlotte, he and Charlotte went in 1927 to Soviet Union, and he came back
Very
very
impressed.
impressed.
What impressed him there?
He basically saw Soviet Union as a nation applying science to life, organizing the society in a scientific manner. Although by 1927, the Stalinist purges had begun, but he was quite insulated from all that. He was like, when you have a, he was like a person, he was crushing over Soviet Union and therefore immune to all the faults. And we shall see uh, how he remained quite immune till several years on, and how it costed him quite
So
a
in
bit.
fact, maybe we can just take a slightly long detour on this. But this whole episode of him going to the Soviet Union, him being impressed by it, and the changes that were happening in Russia, post revolution. So you and I were just discussing a couple of days back about this lovely novel, that A Gentleman in Moscow.
Yes.
So now there are actually, there, I don't know, it's a lovely book which you have read but I haven't, and I'm just watching the series on Amazon. So there are two things in that which I think relates to Haldane specifically. One is, of course, this bit that you have mentioned, that how there is this change in there is this, I mean, in that there is this character who was an ex nobleman, who's now adapting to a new life. I mean, in a society that despises its intellectuals. But even the count, I mean, Alex or Alexander, he there is this instance when he relates, when he explains a bit of biology to Nina, the young girl, when they're talking about the black moth and the peppered moth.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, it is a
And
beautiful sequence in the book.
so the black moth and peppered moth, so essentially there were two prominent dominant varieties, of this moth, as entomologists in England have been collecting. So there is one which was the dominant one, the which is pale in color but has, it has speckles, is speckled. And they were the ones which lived on the trees, and they dominated. Now over time, entomologists started to note that it was actually that this particular variant of the moth started to die out, and it was a smaller variant, which was the black colored moth, that started to increase in numbers. And why was this so? I mean, this was happening primarily because of, as I later found out, because of the industrial revolution. Now, because of all the smokestacks and the black
Soot settling onto the
onto buildings and eventually on the trees, those tree they actually, the sulfur from there, they were destroying the lichen. And moreover, the trees also started to become black, and because of which the birds could easily pick out the pale colored moths which were dominant, and it was the black moths which had a natural camouflage, which so Alexander recounts this story about how one particular class could easily displace another class within Russia. And this was actually the subject of one of Haldane's first, the nine papers that you mentioned. He actually used this to give an example of how natural selection need not always work in slow increments, but in the right set of circumstances, you could see that how environmental factors could actually have a very big influence and completely change the dynamics of a population, sometimes even within a few years.
lifespan. Yeah.
So that's her aside.
That's a beautiful, beautiful detour, and that is another book that everyone should read. It, of course, I would highly recommend everyone to read Saman Subramaniam's biography of JBS Haldane, a dominant character, the radical science and restless politics. But the other one is, of course,
Though they deal
Gentleman,
with completely different,
Gentleman in
this is the
Moscow. But also, Haldane, as a scientist, was greatly impressed with the kind of budgets that Soviet Union was offering to its scientific institutions. And but this was also the time when he was sort of being impressed with Soviet Union, was also the time that he was emerging or already had emerged as an public intellectual. He was, by now, he had started writing for the Daily Worker, which is the
the
official
communist.
newspaper of the British Communist Party. And his columns, they were columns on science, but they wore their science lightly. They also had political sermons, and there is a beautiful line from Samont's book, and he writes about his columns. His columns wore their science lightly, and the political sermon usually came towards the end, like a small vestigial organ flapping weakly in the breeze. And Haldane was also your typical dial-a quote. For all the reporters out there, they will be familiar with this term dial-a quote, when you're desperately trying to beat the deadline and you need an explanation to a concept
The
or
kind that you and I couldn't do our stories without, right? In a
yeah,
crunch.
you usually, every reporter's the phone book has
The
one
dial-a-quote.
person who will pick up the phone and would happily explain stuff without any problem. And there is an apocryphal story about Haldane, that when a journalist asked him what the living world told him about its creator, Haldane replied, he has an inordinate fondness for beetles. That's typical Harding.
And he also said something to the effect of, I mean, the whole debate about, if I mean, how can, if there is a god, how can he permit evil? I mean, one of the basic arguments used against God. And I think he gave the example of God could not exist because if God could not be, if God existed, he would never have made something like the tapeworm, something
Yes,
like that.
yes. Sounds like a sound argument to me, at least. Well, but I will not invite critiques by declaring my position on God on the podcast. But anyhow, coming back to Haldane, he rose to every opportunity for a spat. Imagine, Jacob, if Haldane was alive in today's time, in today's, with Twitter, the kind
Oh,
of opportunity Twitter would have offered to Haldane.
I think Elon Musk could have made friends with him rather than
Donald
Donald Trump.
Trump. Yeah, possible. Because he contradicted everyone, whatever he rightfully thought was there to contradict.
And he was also a natural contrarian, I guess. I mean,
Absolutely.
it was in him being this contrarian public intellectual and a person who was impressed by the Soviet Union as a society, as a newly created society that was implementing science to improve the country. But ultimately, it was this espousal of him that eventually kind of landed him in trouble, especially when the controversial two instances. Number one, of all the Stalinist purges that were going on, and secondly, the infamous what is called the Lysenko controversy, where Lysenko, who was the director of the genetics program in science and in Russia, and he had the full support of Stalin, and his ideas of genetics were actually contrarian. In fact, contrasted, even dealt body blows to Haldane's own ideas, own contributions to science. And the prominent view among geneticists was that Lysenko was flat and dead wrong. But surprisingly, Haldane did not actually use his intellect, his knowledge,
And his
to act,
position.
and his position to contradict many of what were believed to be falsities by Lysenko, and that put him in a very difficult position where people finally started to question whether his politics had completely taken over, had was contradicting with his science, and whether he was in danger, whether he was actually being hypocritical enough, being a hypocrite to his espousal of the scientific method, and giving credence to facts and observations over mere theory.
That's a cliffhanger, Jacob, and I'm
And
sure
we shall discuss this in our
episode.
next and concluding episode on Haldane.
We Because Haldane is such a huge grizzly bear of a man, we thought
We need two episodes
cannot contain him in just one episode, and we shall take off from where we are stopping
The Lysenko affair.
the Lysenko episode.
This is goodbye from me, Shobhana K. Nair.
And bye bye from me, Jacob. Thank you, listeners.